So good evening, everyone, and happy Earth Day. Thanks for joining us. I'm Doug Fabrizio of KUER and RadioWest. And let me introduce the people who are going to be joining us tonight to talk. Christi Cooper, of course, is with us. She's director of the film, Youth v. Gov. Christi started her professional life as a scientist. We talked about this on our radio program not so long ago. As a master's in microbiology, a PhD in neuroscience, but wanted to add filmmaking into the mix, so got another degree in nature filmmaking. One of the first projects was creating this 10-part documentary series about young people suing their states over climate change, which eventually, of course, led to this film. So, Christi, welcome to you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks, Doug.
Olivia Ahnemann is with us. She produced the film, was one of the producers, has been producing and directing documentary films for really more than 2 decades now. Co-produced the film The Cove, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary, also helped produce Racing Extinction, among others. And Olivia Ahnemann, welcome to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Julia Olson, you probably know by now. She's, of course, the executive director and chief legal counsel for the public interest law firm Our Children's Trust. She's joining us this evening. Hi, Julia.
Hi, good to be here.
And Nathan Baring is with us. Nathan's, of course, one of the youth plaintiffs featured in the films from originally, anyway, from Fairbanks, Alaska. He's in Minnesota these days. Nathan, welcome to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I wanted to begin, by the way, make sure if you have comments or questions, please send them to us via the chat that's there, and I'll try to fold those into the conversation as soon as they come. I'll get the ball rolling with a few questions. And I wanted to begin with the question of, I guess I'll start, Julia, with you and we talked a little bit about this on the radio, but your history about bringing cases that are focused on young people's stories or them as plaintiffs. Why young people? Why did you focus on that? Let's start there.
Well, when you're looking at bringing a case, you want to really, and you're bringing in impact litigation, so cases that are going to make a difference in the world, you need a plaintiff that's going to be the best storyteller for you about what is wrong and what's unlawful about, in this case, government's conduct. And when it comes to the climate crisis, young people are unquestionably the most harmed and will be the most harmed over the course of their lifetimes. And so they make a great plaintiff, but they also are people who deserve representation. They don't have the right to vote. They are disproportionately impacted because of their youth and their growing bodies, and they deserve to have a voice in this issue that will affect their entire lifespan.
What are the rest of you, Nathan, I'll get to you in a second, but Christi and Olivia, what are you noticing in young people, just in terms of the way they are engaged in activism these days, that is unique or different, or maybe it's not. Maybe there's some sort of energy in young people that is inspiring and is really interesting. But what is it about young people? How are they different in the way they think about activism that might be different from the way the rest of us do? Christi, what you start?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've learned from these young people over the course of the years of working on this film is not only their real sense of right and wrong and justice, and really looking at it through the lens of justice rather than the political blinders that I think a lot of us tend to see the world through. But I also think that they come into this work, with a real sense of compassion and empathy, and also, they really bring in this, intersectionality into their activism work of really, I think, opening the rest of our eyes into how climate change really impacts so many people and so many facets of our society. And that's something that really the young people have shown me.
What about you, Olivia?
I think for me, what I've observed, and perhaps I was born in the early 70s, so post-Vietnam, and didn't live or wasn't a young person during that time of protest and activism. And in my growing up, there really wasn't a big youth movement or movement of standing up for our rights or protesting against certain things in society. And so when I got involved in this film and see these young people, Nathan and his fellow plaintiffs, uh, really standing up and using their voice and engaging in activism, to me, it represented something that I didn't see in my own generation. We didn't step up to the plate in that way. And I don't know if that's because we didn't feel like a dire sense of what our future looked like. We felt our future was safe and sustainable. And these young people that I've had the opportunity to meet, I've really learned that the future doesn't feel secure to them. And there is a motivation to lend their voice and speaking up about that.
So Nathan, what do you think? Does that resonate with you, this idea that there is a deeper sense of urgency for you? I mean, how do you distinguish sort of the point of view that you have from some of the older people that you encounter, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely affirm what everyone has said. And I guess what I would simply add kind of to Christi's point is, Christi's point on the blinders is very much that young people have this unique moral clarity. And I absolutely don't think that it's in like inherent in young people. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, look at Julia, look at Christi, look at Olivia. I mean, we obviously it's not an issue of like, do you have to be young to have the moral clarity, but it's more about not being invested in the system yet, to not have this perspective to stand outside it and say, what are we sacrificing here for, for the momentary or for tomorrow's, monetary gain? What are we losing in merely 1 or 2 generations? Like what, for example, growing up in the Arctic, being a 3rd generation resident of Alaska, what am I going to not have my grandchildren seeing when I live in that state? Is it going to be a loss of glaciers? Is it going to be a loss of experiences that are oriented to cultures that are unique in the Arctic? And is that worth, the current energy system that we've constructed in this country? And I think that the vast majority of young people, and I would also lump, any age that has the moral clarity to make that distinction, that one of those is obviously more important than the other.
I wanted to ask, this is a question for Christi and Olivia in particular, but the rest of you can chime in as well. And that is, I wondered, Olivia, talk a little bit about the role, your role as a documentary filmmaker, Christi, you too, and that is how you manage the filmmaking part and the activism part. Like, do you see your role as artists, filmmakers, principally or primarily, or as activists, as having an agenda that you want to pursue? Or, do you see yourself as journalists in some way? Olivia, you first.
I see myself as a filmmaker. I've been really fortunate to work on films and shepherd stories into the world that focus on activism, that are about social issues that I find important. I don't consider myself an activist. I've had a much deeper understanding and appreciation for what activism is, especially through some of the frontline activists I've worked with on films like The Cove and Racing Extinction. And I would say with Julia and Nathan and the other plaintiffs, like that's another type of activism. So I see my job and my skills as being able to bring these stories and these efforts that these activists are doing to light and to wider audiences. So that's where I see sort of like my role in a lot of these issues.
So you see yourself, you want to set yourself apart from it. I mean, you may relate to the cause that they're working for, but you want to have a little bit of I don't know, maybe objective distance as a filmmaker? Is that right?
Yeah, I would say to me, it's important as a filmmaker to sort of have a separation from your subjects and your story, and to be able to look at it and put a mirror up to it and look at it objectively. There are often times in filmmaking that you become friends with, you create relationships with people that are the subjects of your film, because you're often working with them for years at a time. But I think for me, I view my job as needing to keep an objective distance or some level of objectivity as we create a story, and try to bring in other voices if it makes sense. Because we're here, I don't think we're necessarily here to make advocacy pieces of film. That's a different kind of filmmaking than sort of a more journalistic approach to subject matter.
Yeah. Christi, how do you see that?
Well, I guess I would say that I'm an impact storyteller. I guess I kind of prefer that terminology. I guess that, you know, I go into telling stories with the objective of creating change with those stories and creating real impact. And whether someone calls that activism or journalism, I think that can be a little bit subjective. But I do think that art in general, I think, is a form of activism. I think that a lot of art plays that role of engaging and activating. I guess if you consider activism a form of activation, then I'm hoping that we are activating people with this story. But I agree with Olivia that, you know, as filmmakers, we do have to keep I think in order to tell a well-grounded, factual, you know, well-rounded story, there has to be some objectivity there in order to do that. I have to say, though, in the topic of climate change, it's a lot harder for me to have an objective stance, because I feel that this is something that is so urgent, and it's really the crisis. It's the number one human rights challenge of our times, and I see my daughter will be affected by that. And so climate change is a little bit harder for me just personally to like put up on the counter and be completely objective about that.
Well, and can I just jump in, Doug, for a sec? I mean, this film wouldn't have been made if it wasn't for Christi's deep humanity and heart, because I would have never let a filmmaker in near these youth who wasn't going to be compassionate and empathetic. And, you know, so Christi really brought her heart, and I know she cares deeply about, you know, the subjects, but, you know, they're humans. And so that was really an important piece to this film even being made.
I wanted to ask you about, so the film lays out the history of the effort of, you know, government leaders and presidential administrations to you know, work behind the scenes to suppress science, to discredit science. And I'm wondering where you think all of this fits in what we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic and the way people and politicians have been talking about science. Are you seeing any connections there with governments who have a particular interest in keeping the idea of, you know, certain science in the public? Do you know what I mean? Are you seeing any connection, this idea of science, discrediting science? Are you seeing this similar kinds of things over the last year with the way people, certain administrations, certain political figures have thought about science?
Is that a general question to any of us?
General question. Anyone take that, because I imagine you all have something. You must have seen something about that. Nathan,
yeah,
you want to go?
I could jump in on that one.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I think it really speaks to, and I say that I have the experience now of being a college student for a full year in this environment, right, where it's you don't ever live outside of COVID, you know, so we're constantly thinking about what the CDC is saying and those kinds of things, because you don't go into your own house and kind of have that kind of autonomy. You're always in a dorm, you're always in a cafeteria, you're always interacting with other people. And I think there are two elements to it that really connect to climate. The first is kind of I guess one is more sinister and one is more kind of speaks to just, how humans are in the world. And starting with the sinister one, it speaks to the kind of prioritization of, certain models of how we do life over kind of the reality of what needs to happen. So, just that simply just means, in the case of climate change, for example, if we're so heavily invested in maintaining a national energy system, then it's an absolute uphill battle to kind of try a paradigm shift and recognize what the gravity of the science is telling us we actually should be doing in order to make any kind of meaningful inroads in climate. And in the same way, right, it's absolutely a struggle to balance the interests of public health and, the maintenance of people's livelihoods. But I think a lot of of what we've seen in COVID is, people feeling deeply invested in, their business or their community in kind of traditional ways that got so disrupted that if the government wasn't there to provide an alternative or to provide some kind of outlet, if they were going to also then come in with these restrictions, then it was much harder for people to take it. And I think, yeah, that's kind of more to the second point on, just the reality that it all comes down to livelihood. I have the perspective being from the most oil-dominated state in the nation that, when we talk about issues of climate change, the first thing that typically comes up in people's minds is the fact that a third of Alaska's private industry is connected to the oil industry. So if we aren't diligently doing that work on the ground to kind of support that energy transition that's necessary to tackle climate change, it's going to be a really tall order to, make meaningful impact in Alaska, in the same way that if the government is going to mandate COVID restrictions based on the best available, public health science, they need to accompany that with, mechanisms to ensure people are still being supported and cared for, and that their communities are still able to thrive despite the challenges of living in a pandemic. So I do think there's a lot of overlap there.
Yeah. Julia, do you see an overlap?
Yeah, I mean, what's sort of shocking to me is I see, on COVID, it does seem like we are really paying attention to the scientists. We know we need to get to the 70% herd immunity, right? Before we can really feel comfortable opening things up. With climate, we know that the safe level of atmospheric CO2 is below 350. We know that 1.5 degrees is dangerous. All the scientists will say that, right? But the Biden administration just today came out with an emission reduction trajectory that takes us probably hotter than 1.5. So they say they're paying attention to the science, but the equivalent with COVID would say, well, we're not going to go to 70% herd immunity. We're going to go to 40% and trust that that's going to be enough, right? And so there just really isn't real science informing the policies on climate.
Olivia or Christi, you guys want to chime in on that one?
Well, I guess I was thinking a little bit more about, I think just like culturally what we've experienced, particularly here in the US, and I guess in other places, with, I think, a lot of people not believing the science around COVID and not listening to it. And I'm not talking about the government, but the general public, that there's a lot of misperceptions and and I feel like that goes all the way back to the story of tobacco, that we for a long time have been, there's been other forces that have had an interest in us not really understanding the real science behind things, whether that was the tobacco industry, whether that was, in my case, in my experience, stem cell research, and how that became a political button with people not understanding very much about it, and then the denial around climate science for a long time, and the sequestering of that knowledge. So there seems to be some resistance, I think, culturally, to wanting to really tackle some of these harder truths.
I'll just chime in quickly and say I've had the privilege of living in my home country, New Zealand, for the last 2 years. I left the US and came down here. And it's been remarkable witnessing people's understanding of science and acceptance of science and how it ties into government policy. It's a very different relationship than I've looked at from afar that's been going on in the US over the last sort of 18 months around the pandemic, but then, deeper in history than that. So it's been fascinating witnessing how government policy and science can coexist for the benefit of the citizens of a country here. And it's not as polarizing, it's sort of science is taken as fact and it's looked at and the data is analyzed and policies are put into place. And I don't know that that's across the board on all things in New Zealand, but it certainly has been around the COVID response and the way that they also look at and tackle climate change here also.
And gun control.
And gun control. Yep.
I wanted to ask about, Julia, talk a little bit about how you're seeing the legal strategy playing out. And I'm probably vastly oversimplifying it by saying, aren't you terrified by the makeup of the Supreme Court? And I'm sure you are to some degree, but how are you thinking about the different levels that you have to, look, once you get to the high court, then you can, I guess, worry about the fact that there are more conservatives than liberals. But how are you thinking about the path you're on? But do talk about the court, by the way, and whether you see some, Gorsuch may surprise people, or Chief Justice Roberts may surprise, I don't know. How are you thinking about all of that at this point?
Yeah.
Julia, you should share how many SCOTUS arguments you've listened to over the last couple of years.
Listen to all of them. I feel like they're my friends.
You're thinking of the right things to say to the certain people who've made certain arguments in the past, I guess.
Yeah, from the very beginning of this case, we knew that this story was not a partisan story, and Democrats and Republicans alike have been destroying the climate system with their policies. And we also knew that really the underpinnings of this case and the foundation was a conservative one. This case is at its core about conserving the nation for the next generation and for our kids. And even, the legal doctrines are very ancient and they precede our country and they are rooted in the founding of our country. And so even the most conservative justices on the Supreme Court right now who look at the law through an originalist lens, we can appeal to those justices and their thinking through our arguments in this case. And so we've been building the case, with that very much in mind, and it's a truth of the case. But, the path the case should take is it should go to trial first. So the normal course of a case is you go to trial, you end up with your final judgment, it goes to the Court of Appeals, and then, a very small fraction of cases reach the Supreme Court. And so the key thing right now is with the Biden administration in office, they don't have to appeal this case. If we get to trial, even if we win, it doesn't have to go to the court. But if it does, we are prepared to argue. And I don't write off the court. I think a lot of liberals do just write off the court because of the presidents who appointed the justices and their backgrounds. But, as you said, Justice Gorsuch, he's surprised people on his Indian law rulings, right? Like he has done things people didn't expect. Same with the chief. And just a couple of weeks ago, Justice Thomas gave us a real gift of an opinion on standing, which is the issue on redressability, wrote an opinion that completely supports our arguments on redressability, which the film tells. And so, we'll be ready. We're not daunted by that task.
What are you expecting from the Biden administration then? Are you just in terms of whether or not they may appeal the case to help you? I mean, is there a conversation with the White House? I'm not sure how much you can reveal or want to, but what's the relationship like with the Biden administration?
Well, right now they still are playing by the same playbook that the prior administrations have played by, and they're fighting us. They have opposed our most recent motion in the district court to slightly amend the complaint, the way we started the case, to correct some things that the Ninth Circuit didn't like. So, they're opposing. They haven't responded to our request to sit down and see if settlement is a possibility. So we'll see what they do next, but I'm hoping that they won't take the extraordinary measures that they did to seek early appeals up in the Court of Appeals and at the Supreme Court. We're hoping that they will change their tune there and play fair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about one of the ideas that Christi, you've talked about, the fact that you wanted this to be a nonpartisan film. Like, you didn't want it to take a particular side. You didn't want to alienate people, and plus, there's plenty of blame to go around. That's pretty clear in the film. And I'm wondering about the scene where Vic is talking to his father. And one of the things you've talked about, Christi, I'm not sure we had a chance to talk about this actually in the radio program, but that you had a similar kind of ongoing debate with your stepfather.
Mm.
And I'm just thinking about people who at Thanksgiving dinner have these ongoing debates with loved ones about, about these kinds of questions, and what you may have learned about the way to have these kinds of conversations with people who don't necessarily agree. And I want to hear all of you on this. Like, if you, because at first you're pissed because they're not listening to just common sense or science or whatever it is, but these are people that you respect or love or are close to you, and you have to find a way to get along. And it seems like one of the ideas in the film is it doesn't want to be partisan. So what are you learning about the way you're communicating with people who don't agree with you right now on whatever it might be, in particular climate change, of course? Christi, you start.
Yeah, I think Vic's story is a really interesting one to kind of ponder on for that discussion. It was really interesting working with Kevin and seeing the struggle that Vic was going through, and trying to really get his father to understand not only that climate change exists, but that it's urgent, and that Kevin's experiencing it in his own communities, and he's seeing it. And interestingly enough, Kevin is he's a journalist, and he's very concerned about, he actually understands that there's environmental impacts to people of color and environmental racism. And, I think he kind of understands that and can speak to that, but there's something kind of, I think for me, it was very eye-opening when he shared with us that it has a lot to do with his belief in God, about whether or not he can believe in the climate changing, because for him, God's in control. And so it was a very hard concept for him to switch and understand that actually humans are causing this problem, and that it's it's not just up to some entity about what's going to happen with our future. So Vic really approached the whole conversation with his dad with a lot of, I think, compassion and willingness to listen, and trying to somehow find some common ground with his father. He was incredibly patient, way more patient than I have been with my own stepfather. Moments of like storming off from the family table because I couldn't stand to be in the conversation anymore. And I think Vic just did an amazing job of just listening and being patient and trying to meet his dad on some ground. And I think that's really key. I think when we are talking with people, regardless of what the issue is, on something that we don't agree upon, I think it's those moments of finding the common ground of what do we both care about, and what, you know, understanding where that other person's coming from and where their concerns lie and what do they care about, and can you somehow connect with them on that level.
Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, I come at this question with two kind of key perspectives. The first is that I was born as a Quaker, which is like a very small, relatively unknown Protestant segment of Christianity, but it's very focused on a lot of the kind of consensus building ideas that that Christi was touching on, you know, and kind of deep reflective listening that's grounded in kind of a shared I would call it like maybe a shared understanding of the same core values that make us who we are, whether that's family, whether that's community, or, you know, the wider world, or God, however one describes that. And you know, it's summed up in a quote that is, "There's that of God in everyone," and that's kind of like the number one touchstone that I had growing up. And then the other one that is kind of more connected to Alaska that I sort of touched on earlier is, you can't talk about any kind of real economic change in Alaska without talking about how we're going to replace the oil industry, because it's just not happening. So when I talk to, and so I'll preface this by saying, when I talk to close friends that literally do not believe in climate change, and I mean close, like people that I've known for many, many, many years, and continue to, you know, frequently hang out with. And, you know, so I'm suing the federal government on climate change. And at the same time, I have friends that don't believe in climate change, right? So it's a funny conundrum. And it's always tied to, oh, well, does your family work in the oil field? Oh, does your grandparent own a construction company that's dependent on, you know, petrochemicals, et cetera, right? So it's a very real negotiation of energy transition when I come at any climate issue. It's a matter of, rather than what I would say is, rather than spending all my time kind of being like, well, why don't you believe in the science? Instead, I say, what do you need? What would you need to, you know, support this kind of necessary transition, which comes more from like, if you recognize where I'm coming from, which is that I believe in the science, you see where I'm going, what would you need to reach the same ultimate end goal? Because if we can both reach the same end goal, which is an equitable energy transition, regardless of, you know, like, of course, I'd like them to believe in the science, but over my life, I've kind of come to realize that most of the time it's not about this doctrine of disbelief or doctrine of denial. It's more a doctrine of, how do I provide for my family, right? So kind of focusing on that, I think, is much more important.
Let's all agree that we hire Nathan to solve this problem. I think he probably could do it. Let me ask a few questions that have come from some of the viewers. Elizabeth wants to know, Julia, this is to you. What have your strategies and outcomes been in some of the other countries with these cases? Is there been what's the difference between responses and outcomes in other countries and this one?
Yeah, good question. We've been involved in really sort of closely working with attorneys in probably 6 to 8 other countries, but there are about 25 youth-led constitutional climate cases suing governments around the world right now in other countries. And we support those as we're able to. And, you know, some of them have been really successful. So there was a case against the government in Colombia, and it was really about deforestation and the constitutional rights of youth to a safe climate and to protect the forests, which are essential for carbon sequestration. And they won in their highest court. And there have been successful cases in Pakistan. So just recently, the Supreme Court of Pakistan said that we need climate democracy and courts need to protect the climate for future generations. So there are some really good decisions coming down. One of the first was in the Netherlands with the Urgenda case, which some people may be familiar with. But there are other courts in other countries like Canada that are still saying The same things that our courts have been saying. The youth don't have a right to be in court. This is a political matter, and the kids in the court should, stay out of it, do it a different way. So it's a mixed bag, but we're seeing more courts abroad come around to the idea that there are these fundamental climate rights at stake, and that youth should at least have access to justice.
One of the things, Julia, you say in the film is, I'll sort of paraphrase here, but you talk about the importance of telling the story, telling the history, getting this out. And I wondered what difference that makes. And Olivia, I wanted to hear you on that question. Like, what difference did the Cove make? And I don't mean to solving an agenda. I'm going to stick with your idea that you wanted to sort of keep some distance with that and tell this story. But what difference do telling these stories make? What have you learned, I suppose, with the Cove or with racing extinction? Like, does that make sense? What difference?
Yeah. I think that one of the differences that telling these stories makes is that they become known. The general public has the opportunity to understand, like, who knew about who knew Taiji, Japan maybe was even a place, let alone what was going on with this historical dolphin drive, a seasonal dolphin drive, and what are the economics behind that. Same with racing extinction. That film came out when discussion was, really just starting around this idea of the sixth mass extinction. Certainly not just starting, but starting to populate into more mainstream conversations and mainstream media. And then you have the ability to tell a compelling film about that, and people can sit down and watch it and be entertained and learn. I think in a lot of ways, keeping aside the actual impact it's had with, say, minimizing the number of dolphins killed in Japan, or it's an awareness piece. More people know about it. More people talk about these issues. The Juliana versus United States case. A lot of people have heard about it. They have followed it in bits and pieces. Some people have not heard anything, and then to be able to sit for almost 2 hours and get to know Julia and get to know Nathan and his fellow plaintiffs and understand the history, to hear Obama use this wonderful rhetoric about the climate, but then at the same time see some of this evidence that Julia in the case is bringing forth. And Christi tells in the film, like, that the words and the actions didn't match. I think these stories and in this format of film have welcomed people into the stories and leave them with a deeper knowledge of it.
It's funny because we had a conversation with a young woman today that actually said to Olivia, "Oh, racing extinction, it completely changed my life, and it's why I went into environmental policy and studied environmental policy in school." And I remember very early, in telling this story, Julia telling me that watching An Inconvenient Truth in the theater, sitting there pregnant with her first child, was an incredibly influential experience for her. So I think these films do somewhere along the way, they are making a difference.
Yeah, they don't have to inspire masses, because sometimes things change by the work of a handful of people, right? So just inspiring the right people at the right time can make a world of difference.
Julie, you said we're locked into this system. How locked in are we?
I asked Jim Hansen.
Are you still driving a car?
I ask Dr. Jim Hansen actually that question frequently about, is there still time? Is there still time? Right? I mean, so we're definitely still locked into the fossil fuel energy system. In the US, 80% of our energy system is still powered by fossil fuels. That is just sick in this day and age, right? But the really great news is the experts say that we could be 80% off of fossil fuels in 10 years. 80%. Like we have all the tools we need to really mobilize. And it's going to require a lot of mobilization, but that mobilization, you know, to Nathan's point, it creates jobs, it creates healthier communities, it creates new and improved infrastructure and steady energy prices. And we're, you know, creating homegrown energy that's not destroying the planet. Like there's such enormous opportunity. I think Biden has that right? He says climate is about jobs. And he's right, we will create new jobs and we need to train people to do the jobs of a clean energy future. I mean, there's no choice. It's just a matter of how quickly we do it, what kind of world we leave for Nathan and all the people who will come after us.
Nathan, you feel hopeful?
I mean, in a short answer, I couldn't do this work if I didn't feel hopeful, right? Because ultimately, if I truly thought that the world was over and that none of this mattered, I wouldn't be in college right now planning to pursue a master's degree and a law degree, right? Because why would I wait in school for another decade to then be done, right? So it's definitely not a matter of thinking that there's no like purpose left. It is just a matter of kind of finding what my mom likes to call spiritual taproots in kind of what I care about, and like looking around in my community and kind of remembering what I'm fighting for, and kind of connecting to, I mean, the Juliana family as kind of one example, right? Like finding 20 other young people from around the country that I now have this deep, you know, 6-year counting connection to. So it's, you know, at the end of the day, we're absolutely falling down a rabbit hole still. But I would not be kind of pursuing these paths if I didn't still believe that there was ultimately always a way out.
Final two sort of questions, and the questions we get all the time, which is, it comes from Maggie, wants to know how to donate to this cause. Julia, maybe you can help her with that. And then the question also of, you know, how people share this film. So Julia, you start.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So you can go to ourchildrenstrust.org and donate to support our representation of young people. We do this all for free for them. So the youth don't pay any costs or attorney's fees or anything. And we're a small organization, but we really rely upon and leverage the dollars that come into us. Our experts all work pro bono for us. We have pro bono attorneys working for us around the country. So it's a good investment in these youth and their future. And thank you.
Yeah, and I would say that people can continue to follow YouthVGov by going to youthvgovfilm.com. And we have a link up there where our ongoing and current screenings are happening. People can sign up there if they are interested in screenings in the future. And we hope to be launching our impact campaign with our public release a little bit later this year. And that will be focused on supporting youth around the country to hold their governments accountable, and supporting our children's trust in their work and these plaintiffs and the lawsuit. So definitely please follow both of us, and there will be hopefully lots of ways that you can yourself get engaged in this and be a part of this.
Well, thank you all for staying up late with us, and at least those of you on this continent. Olivia, thanks for being here in the afternoon. That was great.
Thanks so much for having us. What a
Thank
wonderful
you so
discussion.
much.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, and I want to say to all of those out in Utah who stayed up this late to follow the discussion after the film, thanks so much. Please share the film.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug.
Bye-bye.